"Sir, we need you to step away from the table." At first, people thought it was a joke. Then they saw the man standing there, holding car keys he no longer owned. "Is this really happening?" someone whispered. Hands covered mouths, chairs turned. Nathan didn't move. He just stared at the street, watching his Ferrari disappear. She was different. Didn't try to impress anyone. Answered questions with disconcerting honesty. Laughed when something was actually funny and not out of social obligation. Nathan was immediately fascinated, not by her beauty, which was real but understated, but by the way she seemed immune to the game everyone else was playing. When he asked for her number, Emily hesitated for 2 seconds before typing it into his phone, and Nathan interpreted that hesitation as a challenge, as something to be conquered. He proposed dinner the following weekend, and she accepted with a simple text message that said only, "Okay." No emojis, no performative enthusiasm, just agreement. And that's when Nathan decided he needed to do something memorable, something that would establish from the first moment who he was, or rather, who he needed her to believe he was. The red Ferrari Portofino cost $1,200 per day to rent. Nathan found the rental company through a targeted Instagram ad, one of those businesses that promise to make dreams come true for a price, a temporary bridge between the life you have and the life you want people to think you have. He spent 40 minutes filling out online forms, providing documents, authorizing charges. The primary credit card failed on the first attempt, limit reached. So he used a secondary one that still had room, ignoring the internal voice whispering interest rates and due dates. The confirmation email arrived at 11 at night, subject line in bold with the pickup address and available times. Nathan slept less than 5 hours that night, not from anxiety, but from excitement, from the anticipation of finally living up to the image he carried of himself. On the morning of pickup, he drove his own car, a 7-year-old German sedan that still looked respectable, but was starting to show signs of wear, to the rental place in Culver City.
The attendant was young, maybe 25, with forearm tattoos and a professional enthusiasm Nathan found vaguely irritating. Everything went smoothly until the moment of final signature. The attendant frowned, looking at the computer screen. There was a problem with the payment, he said. Not the initial charge, but an additional verification the system was requesting. Nathan felt his stomach contract, but kept his face neutral, asked what exactly the problem was, and the attendant explained that sometimes the system requested extra authorization for high-value cars, especially for new customers. Nothing personal, just standard procedure. Nathan provided another card, the third one in his wallet, and this time the transaction went through. Green bar on screen, authorization approved. The attendant smiled, handed over the keys, and Nathan drove out in the Ferrari, feeling the engine roar as confirmation of all the choices he'd made over the past 15 years. People on the street looked, some discreetly, others openly, and Nathan allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction, that feeling of being seen the way he'd always wanted to be seen. He had 36 hours ahead of him, an entire weekend, and only one goal that mattered. The chosen restaurant was a French bistro in Santa Monica, not the most expensive in the city, but sophisticated enough, with outdoor tables under soft lights, partial ocean view, clientele that understood social codes without needing to discuss them. Nathan made the reservation for 8 o'clock Saturday night, requested an outdoor table, confirmed by email twice. He spent Saturday afternoon preparing with the care of someone mounting a theatrical production. Long shower, precision electric razor, French cologne applied at the right points, light blue linen shirt that cost $400 at a Beverly Hills boutique 3 months ago. He put his wallet, phone, and a pack of mint gum in the pocket of his beige tailored pants.
At 7:15, he sent Emily a message saying he was on his way, and she responded 5 minutes later with a simple, "Okay." That economy of words Nathan was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her. He got into the Ferrari and drove through the streets of Los Angeles as the sun began to set, that golden light that makes the city look like a movie set. And for the first time in months, Nathan felt he was in the right place, being the right person.
Emily talked about a launch campaign she was coordinating, explained paid media strategies with a clarity that revealed genuine competence, and Nathan listened with divided attention, half processing what she was saying, half monitoring his own responses, making sure they sounded intelligent, engaged, interesting. When his turn came to speak, Nathan described his consulting projects with that combination of enough detail to seem legitimate and necessary vagueness to avoid specific questions. He mentioned a client in real estate, another in tech, talked about portfolio restructuring and asset optimization with the kind of vocabulary that sounds impressive but doesn't say much. Emily listened with a neutral expression, asking occasional questions that Nathan answered by expanding even further, filling the space with words. The waiter brought the starters, salmon tartare for her, carpaccio for him, and they continued talking while eating, Nathan ordering red wine without looking at the price, Emily accepting a glass and drinking slowly. It was during the starter that Nathan began to notice small dissonances. Emily paused before responding, as if weighing something internally, and there were moments when she looked at him with an expression that seemed to be trying to solve a puzzle. She asked where he lived, and Nathan responded with a neighborhood name, omitting that rent consumed half his irregular monthly income. She asked how long he'd had the Ferrari, and Nathan laughed, a laugh that came out a little too forced, and said he'd had it for a few months, letting the lie hang in the air without elaborating. Emily didn't press, but Nathan saw something change in her face, a small retraction, an almost imperceptible retreat.
He tried to compensate by talking more, telling a story about a deal closed the previous year, inflating the numbers, making everything more dramatic, more impressive. But as he spoke, he could feel he was losing her, that each additional word wasn't building connection, but creating distance. The waiter removed the starter plates, and Nathan ordered another glass of wine. Emily declined a second, and the silence that settled was uncomfortable in a way silences shouldn't be on first dates. The main course arrived, lamb for Nathan, grilled fish for Emily, and they ate with less conversation than before, filling the space with observations about the food, comments about the weather, that kind of dialogue that exists only to avoid emptiness. Nathan felt his phone vibrate in his pocket but ignored it, focusing on recovering the rhythm of the night. But then the phone vibrated again, and a third time, too insistent to be spam. He murmured an apology and quickly looked at the screen under the table. 3 missed calls from the car rental company, all in the last 10 minutes. His stomach tightened, but he put the phone back, telling Emily it was just work, nothing urgent, and she nodded without comment. They returned to eating in silence, and Nathan tried not to think about the calls, not think about what they could mean, not think about the possibility that something had gone wrong with the payment, with the authorization, with any of the details he had deliberately chosen not to verify before leaving home. That's when Nathan saw the rental company employee. A man, perhaps 30 years old, polo shirt with the company logo, walking toward the restaurant with a tablet in hand and a professional but determined expression. Nathan felt the blood drain from his face, a physical sensation of dread that started in his chest and spread to his extremities. He saw the man stop in front of the restaurant, look around, then look directly at the red Ferrari parked a few meters away.
Emily noticed the change in Nathan, asked if everything was okay, and he murmured, yes, everything was fine, but his hands trembled slightly as he held his fork. The rental employee entered the restaurant and spoke briefly with the host, who pointed in the direction of their table. Nathan considered getting up, intercepting the man before he arrived, but his body didn't respond. Remained seated as if the weight of the situation had fixed him to the chair. The employee approached, stopped beside the table, and said Nathan's name as a polite but firm question. "Mr. Cole?" the employee said. "Sorry to interrupt your dinner, but we need to resolve an urgent matter regarding the vehicle." Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came out immediately, and Emily looked between the two men, trying to understand the context. "What kind of matter?" Nathan finally managed to ask, and the employee explained there was a serious problem with the payment, that the additional authorization had been reversed by the bank, that multiple contact attempts went unanswered, and that according to the contract terms, the company had the right to recover the vehicle immediately in case of payment failure. Nathan felt each word like a physical blow, and around them, some people at nearby tables began paying attention, that kind of discreet but undeniable attention from those who notice something is happening. "There must be a mistake," Nathan said, his voice coming out louder than intended. "I paid everything. I verified everything." The employee maintained a professional but inflexible tone, explained there was no mistake, that the system had tried to process additional charges according to agreed terms, and all failed, and that Nathan had been informed of this by email and phone multiple times. Emily was absolutely motionless, looking at Nathan with an expression he couldn't read, something between confusion and slow comprehension.
Nathan tried to argue, said he could resolve it right there, get another card, make the payment on his phone, anything. But the employee shook his head and explained that at that point, protocol required the vehicle be returned immediately, that a tow truck was already on the way, that Nathan could come to the office Monday morning to discuss the situation, but right now, the car needed to be secured. Nathan felt the walls closing in, felt the eyes of other diners on him, felt Emily's gaze heavy as lead. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising again. "I'm in the middle of dinner. You can't just take the car." The employee remained calm, explained that yes, they could, that it was all in the contract Nathan had signed, and that if Nathan preferred, they could call the police to facilitate the process, but he hoped that wouldn't be necessary. The word police hung in the air like a threat, and Nathan felt something break inside him, some final wall of dignity crumbling. Emily spoke for the first time since the employee arrived. Her voice was quiet, measured, direct. "Nathan," she said, "just let them take the car." Nathan looked at her and saw in her eyes not anger, but something worse, something like pity mixed with disappointment, the look of someone who just understood a joke they weren't supposed to get. He wanted to explain, wanted to tell her this was all a misunderstanding, that he wasn't what this looked like, but the words wouldn't form, because somewhere deep down he knew that this was exactly what it looked like, that the facade he'd spent years building was collapsing in real time over lamb and red wine at a bistro in Santa Monica. The employee stood there waiting, tablet in hand, and finally Nathan reached into his pocket, pulled out the car key, and placed it on the table between him and Emily. The employee picked it up, thanked him for his cooperation, mentioned again that Nathan could contact the office Monday, and walked away.
Through the restaurant window, Nathan watched him get into the Ferrari, watched the red car pull away from the curb, watched his symbol of success disappear into Los Angeles traffic. The silence at the table was absolute. Emily hadn't touched her fish in minutes. Nathan stared at his plate, at the half-eaten lamb, at the wine glass he'd been holding when his entire self-image imploded. He wanted to say something, anything, but what was there to say? That he'd rented the car to impress her? That he couldn't actually afford it? That his entire life was a performance he could barely sustain? Emily folded her napkin carefully, placed it beside her plate, and looked at him with an expression that was somehow kind and devastating at the same time. "Nathan," she said softly, "I think maybe we should call it a night." He nodded, unable to speak, unable to look at her directly. She stood up, picked up her purse, and paused for just a moment. "You didn't need to do all this," she said,
and he heard in her voice the truth he'd been running from. That the effort to impress had done the opposite. That authenticity mattered more than symbols. That a Ferrari couldn't compensate for the absence of real connection. She left without drama, without anger, just walked out of the restaurant and disappeared into the Santa Monica evening. Nathan sat alone at the table, surrounded by the soft sounds of other people's conversations, other people's normal Saturday nights, other people who weren't currently experiencing the complete collapse of their carefully constructed identity. The waiter approached cautiously, asked if everything was all right, and Nathan almost laughed at the question, because nothing was all right. Nothing had been all right for a long time. He'd just been too invested in the performance to admit it.
He asked for the check, and when it came, he stared at it for a long moment before pulling out his wallet, hoping the card he used would go through, hoping he had enough left for this final humiliation. The transaction went through. He signed, left a tip he couldn't afford, and walked out into the night. The walk back to where he'd parked his actual car, his 7-year-old sedan in a parking structure 3 blocks away, felt like a death march. Every step was a reminder of the gap between who he pretended to be and who he actually was. He thought about Emily, about how she'd seen through him, probably from the beginning, how his overcompensating and over-explaining had signaled insecurity rather than confidence. He thought about the other diners who'd witnessed his humiliation, though he knew objectively they'd probably forget about it by morning, would file it away as just another piece of Los Angeles theater. But he wouldn't forget. He couldn't forget. This moment would replay in his mind at 3 a.m. for months, maybe years. That particular flavor of shame that comes from being exposed, from having the mask ripped away in public. He reached his car, got in, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The leather was worn. There was a coffee stain on the passenger seat he'd never quite gotten out. The dashboard showed almost 90,000 miles. This was his reality. Not Ferrari red and engine roar, but German efficiency slowly declining into middle age. Just like him. He started the car and drove home through streets that suddenly felt different, less like a stage and more like just streets, just infrastructure connecting one place to another. When he got back to his apartment, he didn't turn on the lights, just sat in the dark living room that cost too much, surrounded by furniture that looked expensive but was mostly financed, in a building where he smiled at neighbors while quietly panicking about rent.
His phone, which he'd silenced during the disaster, showed messages. One from Emily, sent 20 minutes ago. It said simply, "I hope you're okay." Not, "I had a good time," not, "let's do this again." Just a basic expression of human concern that somehow hurt more than anger would have. He didn't respond. What could he say? Another message, this one from the rental company, detailing the charges he now owed for breach of contract, for the administrative costs of vehicle recovery, for the damage to their business relationship. Numbers that made his chest tight. He put the phone down and stared at the ceiling, at the shadows cast by streetlights through windows, at the physical evidence of a life constructed on credit and hope, and the desperate need to be seen as successful. The worst part, Nathan realized as he sat there in the dark, wasn't the money he'd wasted, or even the humiliation he'd endured. The worst part was that he'd done it to himself. Nobody had forced him to rent a car he couldn't afford. Nobody had demanded he perform success instead of building it. Nobody had required him to prioritize image over substance. He'd made those choices, day after day, year after year, until the gap between performance and reality became so wide that it took a repo man showing up at dinner to reveal the truth. He thought about Emily's last words, "You didn't need to do all this," and felt the weight of opportunity lost, of connection sacrificed at the altar of ego. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Nathan lay in bed replaying the evening, editing it in his mind.
imagining versions where he'd been honest, where he'd picked Emily up in his actual car, where he'd taken her somewhere unpretentious and just talked, really talked, without the performance. In those imagined versions, maybe she laughed at his jokes. Maybe they discovered shared interests. Maybe there was a second date, a third, maybe something real.
But those were fantasies, alternatives to a reality where he'd chosen spectacle over substance and paid the price in the most publicly humiliating way possible. Monday morning came with harsh sunlight and the obligations of normal life. Nathan had to go to the rental office, had to face the financial consequences of his choices, had to figure out how to pay charges he couldn't afford on top of debts he already had. But before that, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee he'd made at home because going to the expensive place felt obscene now, he made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a complete life overhaul, but a small one. He opened his banking app and looked at the numbers without flinching, without the usual mental gymnastics where he pretended things were better than they were. The numbers were bad. Not catastrophic, but bad. He'd been spending at a rate that assumed income levels he hadn't consistently achieved in over a year. The apartment was too expensive. The clothes were unnecessary. The entire infrastructure of his performed life was unsustainable. He thought about calling Emily, explaining himself, maybe apologizing, but decided against it. What was there to explain? She'd seen the truth. Any attempt to contextualize or justify would just be more performance, more ego protection, more of the same pattern that had led to Saturday night's disaster. Instead, he opened his laptop and did something he hadn't done in years. He updated his resume with honest descriptions of his actual work, without inflation, without making small projects sound like major deals. He looked at job postings for positions that matched his real skill level, not the level he pretended to have reached. He researched apartments in neighborhoods he could actually afford. He made a spreadsheet of his debts and started planning not how to maintain his current lifestyle, but how to scale down to something sustainable. It wasn't redemption.
There was no moment of clarity that fixed everything. Nathan was still the same person who'd rented a Ferrari to impress a woman, who'd built a life on credit and image, who'd prioritized being seen as successful over actually building success. But maybe, sitting there in morning light, with numbers that didn't lie and a memory that wouldn't fade, he could start being someone slightly different. Someone who drove a 7-year-old sedan without shame. Someone who lived in an apartment he could afford. Someone who, if he ever got another first date, would just be himself instead of a performance of who he wished he was. The Ferrari was gone. Emily was gone. The illusion of effortless success was gone. What remained was just Nathan, 44 years old, sitting in an apartment he couldn't afford, drinking coffee and staring at a computer screen, trying to figure out who he actually was underneath all the layers of performance. It wasn't a comfortable feeling. It wasn't the rush of driving a red supercar through Los Angeles sunset. But it was real. And maybe, after years of confusing the symbol for the substance, real was exactly what he needed. If you've ever found yourself caught between who you are and who you think you should be, drop a comment below. Have you ever made a big gesture that backfired? Have you ever watched someone's facade crack in real time? What do you think Nathan should do next? And if this story hit home in any way, make sure you're subscribed to Money Stories That Matter, because every week we explore the real human cost of financial decisions, ego, and the desperate things we do to maintain an image. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's keep having these conversations about money, status, and what really matters when the performance ends and you're left with just yourself. Thanks for watching.